So good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Friday morning breakfast briefing. And today's session is all about adapting to climate change. I'm now going to hand over to Councillor Bora Kwan, who will welcome everyone and open the session this morning.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for sort of tuning in, joining this Zoom at such a sort of early time. I think I've heard that the events have gone really well this week, and it's sort of really encouraging to see that so many people are engaging with our event. Just to explain, I am currently the Chief Whip, but I'm also the outgoing chair of the Community Safety and Environment Policy and Accountability Committee. We tend to call them PACs for short. So that's the reason that I've been asked to present this, because a lot of the scrutiny work that I've done over the last sort of 3.5 years has been around, half of it has been around the Council's efforts to address the climate emergency, and I had the honour of actually being able to propose a motion a couple of years ago where we declared the climate emergency, and it's really timely, I think, that we are having this event at the moment. We've organised it as a council, this week-long carnival, to highlight and inspire action in the run-up to COP26. Now, as you know, COP26 is going to bring together nations across the world to accelerate action on the climate emergency, and we are at a crucial moment. I'm sure many of you who are interested and have been watching the news will remember the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, most often referred to as the IPCC report. That report revealed the inadequacy of action to date that the world has taken. Global temperatures are now likely to rise by more than 1.5 degrees within the next 2 decades. So only drastic reductions in our emissions by 2030 can prevent the most devastating global consequences of rising temperatures. So today, the presentation and my colleagues, the council officers, are going to be looking at climate adaptation and the role of green space in protecting us from the impacts of climate change. The climate adaptation has often been overlooked nationally in discussion and investment relative to mitigation. The UK Committee on Climate Change's most recent risk assessment, which was published this summer, highlights the gap between our readiness and the risks that we face. Some of the striking dangers are raised in this report, which include the 2018 heat wave, which saw 864 heat-related deaths and 10,000 sorry, I always get this word wrong, subsidence claims. I think I've actually mispronounced that, but anyway, by 2050, beech trees won't be able to tolerate the climate of southern England, and our supply chains for food, medicines and other goods are at risk from climate risks such as floods in key supplier countries overseas. I know that this is something we've all been acutely made aware of recently because of supply chain emergencies due to things like Brexit and also the pandemic, while climate change is also going to affect supply chains. It's vital alongside mitigation, as we know, climate change is already underway. 1 degree centigrade warming has already happened, and it's projected to continue, and more frequent and severe extreme weather is expected, including heat waves and flooding. Now, recently, we witnessed the impact that flooding can have on homes and businesses in West London and in our borough earlier this summer. It's really important for tackling inequality, as the most vulnerable are often the worst affected. Poorer people tend to live in more dense and high-rise housing, which is prone to extreme heat. And some of those most at risk from heat waves include older people, disabled people, and those with respiratory conditions, and homeless people. The solutions also, thankfully, the solutions can actually benefit biodiversity and human health and create a more beautiful urban environment. Nature-based solutions are most effective, including increasing tree coverage, depaving, and green roofs and walls, as well as cooling buildings and reducing flood risk. these solutions can give a home to our wildlife, they can clean our air and absorb CO2. And they can also bring mental health benefits, better access to quality green spaces. Again, I think something that we've all had to appreciate over the pandemic, when we didn't have the freedom to roam sort of far and wide to find green spaces. I think the ones on our doorstep really were our lifesavers. Adaptation is an area where small actions by many of us can make a great cumulative difference. Some examples include planting a tree, replacing hard paving with planting, and fitting water-saving taps and shower heads. Okay, I'm now going to hand over to the next speaker. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the session. And again, thank you so much for joining in.
Thank you very much, Councillor Kwan, for that introduction, and great that you're able to join us this morning. So again, just to echo what we've just heard, next week, the UK is hosting world leaders for the UN Climate Change Conference, COP26. So from the 1st to the 12th of November, world leaders will be gathering in Glasgow to discuss the climate and ecological emergency and our contribution to that, and how we can radically reduce emissions to make sure that we're protecting people and planet. But we know that whatever is discussed and agreed in Glasgow will need to be delivered at a local level. And that's why we wanted to run this week of events and activities that are really focused on action, that are focused on education and awareness, so learning about this broad issue that cuts across everything that we do and how we live our lives, but also showcasing good things that are already happening in our borough and inspiring us all to take climate action together. So we do have a fab program. I'll touch on some of the events that are happening at the end, but please do have a look at the website and check out the program. We have recently published our climate and ecology strategy as well. So this is called H&F 2030. And this sets out the route to get to net zero emissions across the whole borough. So this is 20 years ahead of the national target. And this sets out how we will eliminate our emissions from our homes, buildings and energy, in everything from how we construct buildings to the way that we heat and power our built environment. It also looks at shifting the way of how we travel and how we move around, away from polluting petrol and diesel vehicles towards more active ways of travel, like walking, wheeling and cycling, as well as using public transport and shared electric car club schemes. We also know there's carbon emissions in all of the things we buy and use, and also greenhouse gas emissions hidden in our food as well. And that's one of the things that we're really passionate and dedicated to trying to measure and understand the impact of that and reduce those emissions as well. And then today's session is more about how we're going to protect people and nature, and how we're going to make ourselves to the changes that are underway, both in terms of hotter summers and in terms of managing flooding risk. So please do have a look at that climate and ecology strategy on our website, and join our 4 p.m. briefing to learn more about what we're doing to make space for nature and enhance biodiversity in the borough as well. So today we've got 3 fab colleagues who will be speaking. We've got Jim from the climate unit talking about why adapt to climate change. We've got Ian from our highways team talking about some projects about greening the grey. And then we've got Paul from our planning team who will be talking about how we are managing climate risks through planning. So again, please use the Q&A. We'll have plenty of time at the end to get to those questions. And I'll now hand over to my colleague Jim, who'll talk about adaptation.
Thanks a lot, Emily, and thanks, Councillor Kwan, for that introduction as well. That's great. My little talk will be about why adapt to climate change. So next slide, please, Emily. So what is adaptation? Well, it's about making changes now so that our people, our buildings, infrastructure and our local environment can cope with extreme weather and a changing climate. So this includes reducing the impact of extreme weather risks and also improving our resilience when they do occur. And the reasons for this are to kind of protect our health, to tackle inequalities, also avoid disruption to our lives on the kind of social and economic scale. Next slide, please, Emily. And why do we need to do this? Well, the use of fossil fuels is causing climate change around the globe. And we know that the impacts that this is having already and will continue to have are on the global level, but also on the national and local as well. So this image to the right is just an illustration of an impact locally in recent times. So during the summer heat wave last year, which was unprecedented, the high temperatures caused further cracking in the pedestals of Hammersmith Bridge. So this is an image of them being cooled down, and this led to the bridge being closed for a full year, but to pedestrians and cyclists, as well as the traffic, which was already closed to. Next slide, please, Emily. So what are some of these risks? Well, extreme heat is one of them, and that slide just previously was illustrative of that. So London is expected by the Met Office to be between about 2 and 5 degrees hotter by 2050 at its extremes. And Public Health England projects that heat-related deaths could increase by 500% on what they are during our heat waves today. Next slide, please, Emily. Flooding is also a serious risk locally, and once again we unfortunately saw the effects of that earlier this summer on the 12th of July, when due to the sewers reaching capacity and overflowing, 150 properties were affected by flooding. And we know that climate change already is and will continue to increase the frequency and severity of this. Now, this is particularly impacted by the prevalence of hard surfaces in the local area and the low sewer capacity we have underneath us. Next slide, please, Emily. Water supply is also perhaps a kind of a lesser communicated risk and perhaps a little less visible to us. We turn on the taps and we expect water to come out, but London is actually has high risk sources for 25% of its water, and there's projected to be a 400 million litre daily shortfall in the water that we need and the water that's available to us in London by 2040 if no action is taken. Next slide, please, Emily. And then there are other impacts as well, often caused by the kind of first three that we've spoken about, and sometimes caused by these sort of climate risks occurring abroad. So can impact on supply chains. So kind of risks like the one we're seeing at the moment with difficulty getting products over to us, and kind of spikes in fuel prices due to particularly cold winters, for instance, are an example of this. We can also see issues such as new diseases and pests occurring as our climate warms and becomes more hospitable to different diseases, and things like biodiversity loss, potential for power outages, particularly during heat waves, and damage to carbon sinks like peatlands, which release more carbon, creating a negative feedback loop. Next slide, please, Emily. So what can we do about it? Well, the first thing we need to do is understand the risk. So the council keeps plans for flooding, which it updates on a regular basis as part of the kind of statutory role. And we're using mapping about the vulnerabilities in the borough, both vulnerability to the risks from heat, from flooding, and also where the people who are most at risk are based. So, you know, where do we have high concentrations, for instance, of older people or people with disabilities who are likely to be particularly badly impacted? And then also thinking about which services might be affected as well. So, so planning around the resilience of those, whether that's social care or whether it's around maintaining our highways. Next slide, please. And what can we, what can we do about it? We can go green. So natural approaches are some of the most effective ways to manage these risks. So green spaces cool the environment and help to kind of manage high temperatures and also absorb heavy rainfall as well. So there are things we can all do for this, like planting trees, replacing hard surfaces in our gardens with planting, or even installing a green roof or wall. There are things that the council is doing about this as well, which my colleagues will talk to you about in very shortly. So around greening the grey through our highway schemes, our estates, and also through our planning processes, so achieving these through planning applications. Next slide, please, Emily. So this is just an example of a nice approach that someone has taken in their drive. So they've left space to park their car, but they've taken away areas of hard surfacing and replaced one strip with permeable paving to allow water to soak through and reduce the risk of flooding in the area. And then they've planted the other side there. And you can have a look at our Living with Rainwater guide, which is on our website, for tips on how you can do this in your own home. Next slide, please, Emily. So we also need to modify our buildings. So we need to make them cooler, and we need to reduce the amount of water that they use. There are various ways we can do this, some of them quite inexpensive, some of them slightly more sort of involving a bit more investment. So a simple one that's common in other parts of the world is painting our roofs white, particularly kind of flat roofs, which reflects back heat in the summer and can have a very strong cooling effect. But also very simple interventions that can help kind of prevent drought and water shortage, like fitting low flow shower heads and low flush toilets. And the council will be adopting this into our sort of capital works, so particularly around housing, and when we're kind of looking at capital works for housing, how we can adopt adaptive measures into this. Next slide, please, Emily. Thanks. And then finally, it's about building strong networks and planning for the risks ahead. So a really important thing to keep in mind is that we cannot eliminate the risk of these extreme weather events happening. They sadly will be a feature of the future. So what we need to do is integrate risks into our decision making. So all of our decisions, particularly around kind of capital decisions for our housing, our infrastructure, like our highways, need to be thinking about how resilient they are and how resilient they make the borough to these kind of future risks around heavy rainfall and extreme heat. So my highways colleagues will and planning colleagues will talk to you a little bit about what we're doing there in a moment. And then we also need to protect the people most at risk. So you know, we can do that as a council through our social care and public health roles. But we can also all do this as individuals by thinking about who we know in the borough who might be at risk during the hottest weeks and months of the year. And you know, sort of whether their sort of properties put them at risk, for instance, of flooding, and helping to think about that. And our sort of Living with Rainwater guide, I would really recommend anyone to have a look at to consider their own sort of resilience as well. And I'll hand back to Emily to introduce the next speaker.
Thank you for that introduction, Jim. I'm now going to hand over to Ian in the Highways team, who will talk about what we're doing as a council in greening the grey.
Good morning, all. Very grey and wet morning. Probably a good backdrop for what I'm going to be talking about. So, greening the grey is quite a broad term. So it does mean that we are changing what our highways look like. So taking hard surfaces off the highway and actually adding more green infrastructure. But it's also looking at the materials we use, and we're using more permeable material. It's also how we look at our footways as well, and changing the way that they look as well. So it's a combination of greening the grey and the materials we use, and actually looking at public space in a very different way. So greening the grey for highways is a bit of a mission, because we're looking at how we deliver our service in a very different way. Next slide, please, Emily. So we've done roughly about 40 sustainable drainage schemes. They're quite unique and they're very different. So one of the ones that often gets flagged up is Australia Road. And Australia Road was a typical highway, had a carriageway, had a footway either side, had a school one side and a little park the other side. We completely changed the dynamics there. So we pedestrianised it, we put in pocket parks, But we did something slightly more radical than that. We actually engaged with the people that wanted to use that space in a different way. So my engineers had sessions with the school children and residents, and we run design sessions about what they would want to see in this particular space. And we kind of used that template for virtually every scheme that we now deliver. So my engineers, when they do schemes, the first thing that goes in, they look at is what can we do in terms of greening and climate change? And it's a real culture change. And why this is important, most people won't know, but underneath our feet, there is a sewer system that Thames Water manages. It's about 150 years old and it's brick built. It was designed to take the sewage for around 2 million people in London. That system hasn't changed over the years and is still roughly the same system that we've got now. Roughly about 90% of the sewer network underneath Hammersmith and Fulham is actually that Victorian sewer. And our water, our rainwater gullies connect to that sewer system. So that's the reason why it's really important why we control water. On the 12th of July, we see what can happen if we get large amounts of water all at one point. So in 5 hours, we had a month's worth of rain fall on West London, and that resulted in surcharges. So our rain gullies worked, but their backup system is the sewer, and the sewer system couldn't cope with the levels of water that was going into it. And the result of that is that the water will find a way. What often happens is that it will go into people's property, so it will go for the toilets and through baths. So some of the work that we do is about relieving that pressure on the sewers. It's taking away hard surfaces, and it is around delivering changes in those hard surfaces. And it's about working across the piece. So it's highways, housing, and also parks. Next slide, please. Some of the interventions we do is around trees, low planting, wildflowers, mobile parklets, so having green infrastructure into parking spaces, dwell spaces. So to changing the dynamics of the street, we also use a material called FlexiPave, which is actually a recycled material. It's got recycled rubber in it, and we're using that more and more on our infrastructure in parks and actually in some of our highways as well. Next slide. Grass verges. I think 10 years ago, when I took over highways, I think we were taking out grass verges. We've completely changed the dynamics of that. So we're now returning grass verges into streetscapes. Some of the interventions we do are costly, and they're costly because they're new. So one of the interventions we do in terms of trees is a tree root system, and how that works is that a tree requires air in the soil, and we as engineers love to compact things, so to compress the soil. So how the tree root system works is it allows us not to need to compress the soil. It also manages the utility cables and pipes that are near the roots, but it also allows the roots to breathe. So some of you will notice when you walk along a highway, a footway, you will notice that the tree roots are coming up to the surface. That's them looking for air. So these systems allow them to stay underground and to protect our footway. So it's an innovative way of how we deliver footpaths. We are doing quite a bit of work around how many of these schemes we can put in. So our highways maintenance plan, part of the deal there is that we also look for greening opportunities as well. And an interesting fact is that our contractor, as of now, 96% of what they take out, so every time they do jobs and they take stuff out of our highway, 96% of that is recycled. And this council used, one of the first councils to use an electric digger to actually do works, and it works on King Street and works on North End Road. We're actually using that electric digger, and we, working with Conways and another borough, will be introducing the first electric grab lorry to be deployed in the UK. So there's lots of work around how we deliver stuff as well. Next slide. And finally, pocket parks. People love pocket parks. We've introduced them in lots of areas. Australia Road was the first, and we're planning to do a lot more. So we've got a future project where we look to put a garden each end into a pedestrianised space, but actually use the pedestrianised space in a different way. So we add a green infrastructure to that. That's one of many. So we're on the lookout to do those, to do more of these pocket parks. And as you say, we are looking at highways maintenance and how we deliver our works in a much different way. Next. And finally, bike parking. So smarter travel is a key priority for highways and for transport. And so we're changing the road space as well. What actually uses that space? So we're doing infrastructure for cycling. We're looking at, again, parklets as well for taking up parking space. We're introducing bays for e-scooters for the hire scheme. So how we have highways infrastructure is also being changed as well. I think that's me done.
That's great. Thank you, Ian. And now over to Paul from our planning team.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Can we go on to the next slide? So I'm going to talk about planning's role in adapting to climate change. So the council is a planning authority, so it sets the rules for new development in the borough. We can't control all new development in the borough because there are certain ways that development can happen without having to comply with our planning policies, for example, permitted development rights that exist and change of use rights that exist and so on. But generally, if people want to do, certainly if they want to do major works, they have to put in a planning application, and that will be assessed against our local plan document, which is the middle document there on the image, which sets out key policies on a number of areas, including adapting to climate change. The London Plan is also a relevant document, particularly for the large scale proposals. And we also have a planning guidance document, which sort of sets guidance and information on how planning applications or what sort of supporting information should be included with applications to comply with their policies. We've got one document that covers everything. The GLA have a lot of their own documents as well, providing guidance on complying with their own policies. So our local plan was actually adopted in 2018. So the policies that we've got in there, they all predate the last couple of years of the emergency climate emergency declaration and all the work that's gone on since that declaration. But we do still have references to climate change and the need to mitigate and adapt. So, for example, I'm not going to read out the full spatial vision piece of text that's there, but that's something that is in our local plan, where there's a reference to this is what we want to see. We want to see new developments to adapt to climate change. There's a broader reference to delivering an environmentally sustainable borough as well. We don't have a standalone planning policy on climate adaptation or managing climate risks. I don't think there is such a single policy either in the London Plan, but managing climate risks is covered by a number of policies, which I will look at briefly in the next few slides. So policy CC2, this is one of our local plan policies. It's quite a broad sustainable design and construction policy. So this references the adaptation to the potential impacts of climate change. And it sort of makes specific reference to heat waves, droughts, and potentially wetter winters there. So large developments, for example, major schemes are required to provide a sustainability statement that shows compliance with this policy. This is just an excerpt of text that their sort of actual policy is much sort of wider than that and sets particular requirements. Policy CC3 and CC4, these are a couple of key policies for us on flood risk and sustainable drainage. CC3 is also dealing with water use. Can we go on to the next slide, please? Drought, there's not a specific policy in our local plan just on drought, or it is mentioned in the policy CC2 and CC3 in relation to water efficiency. Overheating impacts, again, not a specific policy just on overheating in our local plan. I think there is one on managing heat risk in the London plan, but for all major schemes in particular, so anything in terms of residential development, anything with 10 or more new residential units, that's classified as a major scheme. And so that has to include an energy assessment for the application that comes in, showing the energy use, associated carbon emissions, and detailing all the energy efficiency, renewable energy measures, and so on to reduce carbon emissions. But it also has to include an assessment of the overheating risks. And then the final policy that I've referenced there is one of our open space references, policies at OS5 on greening the borough. So that's one of the policies which it covers open space, green infrastructure, and biodiversity in particular. So those are our key local plan policies. London plan has got a range of policies as well. That's the London plan from 2021. So they've sort of managed to move things on compared to our 2018 local plan. So I'm going to look at those sort of four sort of main areas of climate impacts and just look at briefly how we're dealing with those with planning applications. So many applications will have to come in and provide a flood risk assessment with the application because of the flood risks that are present in the borough. There are different types of flood risk. So the flood risk assessment has got to assess whatever the relevant sources of flood risk are for the site that's being developed. Climate change impacts are taken into account in terms of the assessment that needs to be carried out in the flood risk assessment by taking account of a 40% increase in rainfall. So when a storm event is being assessed and looking at the impacts that could have on the site, the scenario that they are assessing the site for is a 1 in 100 year storm plus another increase for climate change on 40%. We also assess the year 2100 in terms of sea and river level rises. So that's particularly important for proposals close to the river where they could be impacted if the flood defences were breached. So what we look for in the flood risk assessment is appropriate mitigation measures to be outlined, to be included in the design. These might be different from site to site or case to case, depending on what the risks are and what the nature of the application is, whether it's a new build, whether it's a change of use or extension, refurbishment, and so on. But some of the things that can be done is to raise floor levels. That can sometimes be done in new developments. Resilience measures need to be included. So those are measures that can help make the property more resilient if it does flood. Structural waterproofing and sewer surcharge protection is particularly important for basements, residential basement properties. And also we have a requirement for sustainable drainage systems or SUDS measures to be included, which provide multiple benefits, help to reduce the amount of rainwater that's draining off into the sewer system, and they can also provide a number of other benefits in terms of you know, if they're soft landscape features that are doing that, then they provide biodiversity benefits. In terms of overheating, as I mentioned, there's an assessment that needs to be included on overheating for the which is part of the energy assessment that comes in with the planning application. And what we're looking for is for overheating to be prevented as much as possible, and to use passive measures by looking at the orientation of new buildings, also looking at using passive ventilation, openable windows and so on, where this is possible, using shading or integrating measures. Actually is shown on the image there on the right, using measures to provide some shading and cooling. Trees and planting as well can be integrated, and they can provide cooling, reduce the urban heat island effect. What we're certainly looking to avoid wherever we can is the inclusion of air conditioning systems. And there is a cooling hierarchy of measures that should be included wherever possible. So we sort of move down the hierarchy, looking to get the preferred measures, that the passive ventilation and shading and so on wherever possible. In terms of managing water use, Jim has mentioned about the fitting of water efficient fittings and appliances and so on. So this can be done in new developments in particular, but we also press for this where we've got sort of changes of use which may result in your bathrooms, kitchens and so on being changed over. We have rainwater harvesting systems prioritised as part of our SUDS hierarchy as well, which is collecting rainwater for reuse, whether that's to collect it and store it and then reuse it to flush toilets, which is what is shown in the diagram on the right. But rainwater harvesting, it can also include collecting rainwater and storing it and then using it to irrigate landscaped areas, for example. So that could be on a small scale, or it could be on a large scale. Some of the larger scale developments have a lot of planted areas. They may need watering, and so we look for the rainwater to be collected and reused on the site. The target that we've got is on in our planning policies 105 litres per person per day limit for new residential units. So that is a more stringent target than the one that is sort of a standard building regulation target. So we will assess the water use calculation that comes in with the planning application and make sure that it's complying with our planning policy requirement rather than the building regulation requirement.
Well, is it okay if we finish this in just 1 minute? I'd just like to get to a couple of questions.
Yes, I think this is my last slide, I think, so we should be okay. So for biodiversity impact, so wherever there's new development going on, it might be more likely that the major schemes, but it could be the smaller schemes. They need to assess what levels of biodiversity are on site, and if there's protected species or habitats there, and they need to be able to protect those, but also create more through tree planting, soft landscaping. Encourage planting which provides for pollinators. That's something that the Biodiversity Commission were particularly keen on when they published their report a few years ago, 2017. And what we try to discourage as well is extensive impermeable surfaces, because they don't provide any benefits in terms of biodiversity. They don't enhance biodiversity. So we try and avoid those wherever possible. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Sorry to rush you. I know this is a huge topic. So yeah, I'm really grateful to learn what we're doing in terms of planning. Thanks for that, everyone. So finally, just before we wrap up, what is on today? If you have a look at the programme, which is on lbhf.gov.uk/climate-carnival, you can have a look at some of the events that are happening today. We've usually got a couple of webinars in the afternoon and lots of events happening out and about all over the borough. So please do have a look. We've got over 50 things happening this week. So please do check out the programme and get involved if you have time later today. And finally, just before we wrap up, please do sign up to our newsletter. So this is a monthly newsletter all about climate action taking place across the borough. We talk about what we're doing as a council, things that are happening in the community, things you can get involved in, as well as what we're reading and sharing. So if you head to the climate pages on our website, you can sign up for Climate Connects. And finally, that's us for this morning. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming along, to all of our speakers for presenting and for everyone's questions and comments. That's our generic email address there that comes through to me. So look forward to speaking with you there, and our web address as well. Thanks, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the week.